Josiah Garrett told Ingrid Svensson she would need 8 cords of wood to survive a Dakota winter. She had $47, a milk cow, and 2 small children. The nearest timber was 23 miles away. A woman alone can't cut that much, he said. Sell your claim and go back east. Don't let pride kill your kids. She didn't leave. She built a stone column, 1,900 pounds of fieldstone, in the center of her cabin. When the worst blizzard in Dakota history hit in January 1881, lasting 9 days at 40 below zero, she burned half the wood her neighbors did. Her cabin stayed warm while they burned furniture. Everyone said she would freeze. The stone said otherwise. The stove had gone cold 6 hours ago. Outside, the temperature had fallen to 40 degrees below zero, and the wind drove snow so fine it sifted through cracks around the door and settled like white dust on the floor. February 1881, the 7th month of the worst winter Dakota Territory had ever seen. Ingrid Svensson placed her palm against the stone column in the center of her cabin. Warm. Not hot. The fire had been dead since midnight, but warm as sun-baked earth. Warm as bread fresh from the oven. The column stood 4 feet 8 inches tall and 26 inches across, built from 1,900 pounds of fieldstone mortared together with clay and sand. It rose from a foundation of flat rock she had laid herself, positioned 3 feet from the iron stove with a gap for the door. Her children slept. Anna, 7 years old, curled beneath 2 quilts with her arm around her brother Carl, who was 4. Their breath did not fog in the air. The cabin held at 48 degrees, cold enough to need blankets, warm enough to survive. Through the frost on the window, Ingrid saw smoke rising from the Garrett cabin 2 miles north. They were burning something. At this hour, in this cold, with the fire already built high, that meant they were burning furniture, chairs, a table, whatever wood remained. The Hendricks family, a mile and a half northeast, had run through 5 cords already. They had started with 6. Ingrid had started with 5 1/4. She had 3 cords left. The stone remembered the fire, and that memory was keeping her children alive. But 8 months earlier, there had been no stone column, no cabin warm enough to survive. Only a widow with 2 children, $47, and a homestead claim that everyone said would kill her before spring. The letter from the land office had arrived in April of 1880, postmarked Yankton, Dakota Territory. Ingrid read it standing in the doorway of the room she rented in St. Paul, Minnesota, while her children ate porridge at a borrowed table. Her husband, Eric, had filed the claim 3 months before he died. 160 acres in Kingsbury County near a settlement called De Smet. The Homestead Act required 5 years of residence and improvement to own the land outright. Eric had made 1 trip to start a cabin, driven stakes for a garden plot, and come home with plans for the life they would build together. Then the typhoid took him, 3 weeks from first fever to burial. He died in their rented room with Ingrid holding his hand, leaving her with 2 children, a trunk of tools, and a piece of paper that said she could own land if she could survive on it. The alternative was clear. She could sell the claim for whatever a speculator would pay, perhaps $30, and use that money to, what? Return to her family in Norway? She had no family there anymore. Find work in St. Paul? Doing what? With 2 children too young to leave alone? Remarry? Hand over everything Eric had worked for to a stranger who might or might not be kind. Or she could go to Dakota and try. She went. The wagon ride from the railroad station at Tracy took 4 days. Ingrid sat on the bench with Carl in her lap, and Anna pressed against her side, watching the landscape flatten and empty as they moved west. Trees disappeared, first the dense forests, then the scattered groves, then even the lone cottonwoods along creek beds. By the 3rd day, There was nothing but grass to every horizon, an ocean of green and brown that moved in waves under the wind. The driver, a man named Holst, who hauled freight and passengers between Tracy and the new settlements, pointed to the horizon. "No wood out here," he said. "That's what kills people. They come from Ohio, from New York, from the old countries, and they think they'll build a fire like they always did, but there's nothing to burn." Ingrid had grown up in Norway, then Minnesota. She knew cold. She knew wood fires. She did not know treeless. "What do people burn?" she asked. "Buffalo chips, when they can find them. Cow chips from their own stock. Hay twisted into sticks burns fast, but it burns. Corn cobs, corn stalks." Holtz shrugged. "Some people burn their furniture when it gets bad enough. Some people just freeze." Anna looked up at her mother. Ingrid kept her face still. "Where is the nearest timber?" she asked. "Big Sioux River, maybe 20 miles east of your claim, maybe 25. Cottonwood mostly. Some oak. Hard trip with a wagon. 20 miles, each way. 2 days minimum for a round trip, more if the weather turned or a wheel broke or the draft horse threw a shoe. And she didn't have a draft horse. She had a milk cow. The cabin Eric had started sat on a low rise a quarter-mile from a creek. The walls were up, rough-cut lumber hauled from the Big Sioux before he got sick, but there was no roof complete, no floor laid, no stove installed. The door was a blanket nailed across the opening. The windows were oiled paper. Ingrid stood in the doorway of the half-built cabin with her children beside her and her trunk of tools at her feet. May 28th, 1880. Snow still possible. First killing frost likely in late September. That gave her 4 months to build a roof, lay a floor, install a stove, plant a garden, put up food for winter, and gather enough fuel to keep 3 people alive until spring. She had $47, a milk cow, 6 chickens, and no neighbors within a mile who knew her name. The first person to tell her she would fail was Josiah Garrett. Garrett ran the closest thing to a general store in DeSmet, a timber frame building with a hand-painted sign and shelves half empty from supply shortages. He was 54 years old, had homesteaded in Dakota for 2 years, and had watched 3 families die in that time, 2 from cold, 1 from a prairie fire. He wasn't cruel. He was experienced, and experience on the frontier meant knowing how people failed. Ingrid came into his store the first week of June to buy nails for the roof. She counted coins onto the counter, $8 for 10 pounds of nails, while Garrett studied her. "You're the Svensson widow," he said. "The Norwegian woman with the claim north of the creek." "I am. Eric's wife. He came through last fall. Good man. I was sorry to hear." Ingrid nodded and did not trust herself to speak. Garrett wrapped the nails in paper and set them on the counter, but did not release them. "You have children, a girl and a boy, people say." "Yes. And you're planning to winter on that claim, alone." "Yes." Garrett's face shifted. Not pity exactly, something harder. "Mrs. Svensson, I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to hear it as a kindness, even if it doesn't feel like one. You will need 8 cords of wood to survive a Dakota winter, maybe 10 if the winter runs hard. That's the minimum. You understand? Not comfortable, minimum. Below 8 cords, you start burning furniture. Below 6, you start making choices about which rooms to heat and which to let freeze. Below 4, people die." Ingrid felt the number like a weight. 8 cords. "The timber's 23 miles from your claim," Garrett continued. "A cord of wood is a stack 4 feet by 4 feet by 8 feet. That's about 1,500 pounds, give or take. You'd need a wagon and a team to haul it, and you don't have a team. You have a milk cow. I'll find a way." "Will you?" Garrett leaned forward. "Because here's the math, Mrs. Svensson. Even if you could get to the timber, even if you could cut it, which takes a man 8 hours of hard labor for one cord, you'd need 16 trips with a wagon to haul 8 cords. That's 32 days of travel alone, not counting the cutting. You have 4 months until snow flies. That's not enough time to get the wood and finish your cabin and tend your garden and put up food and care for 2 children. It's not possible. I'll find a way, Ingrid said again. Garrett shook his head. I've seen 3 families freeze in 2 years. Good people, strong people. They all thought they could find a way. He slid the nails across the counter. Sell your claim and go back east. Find your children a father. It's the kind thing, the smart thing. Don't let pride kill your kids. Ingrid took the nails. Her hands were steady. Her voice was not. Thank you for your advice, Mr. Garrett. She walked out into the June sunshine and stood beside her wagon and did the math herself. Garrett was right. The numbers didn't work. June passed in a blur of labor. Ingrid finished the roof by working from dawn till she couldn't see, shingling by feel in the fading light. Anna watched Carl, fed the chickens, pulled weeds in the garden patch Ingrid had broken with a borrowed plow. Carl was too young to work, but old enough to carry water from the creek in a small pail, sloshing half of it out on the walk back, proud of what remained. The floor went in board by board. Lumber she bought was $16 from a man hauling excess from a failed claim. The stove, a small cast-iron model, second-hand, with a cracked flue ring she patched with clay, cost another $12. By mid-July, the cabin was livable. 4 walls, a roof, a floor, a stove. 16 feet by 12 feet of enclosed space that belonged to her, and 1.5 cords of wood. Ingrid had made 3 trips to the Big Sioux, each one eaten 4 days. She left before dawn, drove the cow-pulled wagon across the empty prairie, cut wood until dark, slept in the wagon bed, cut more the next morning, loaded what she could haul, and drove home. Each trip yielded half a cord, maybe a little more. Her shoulders ached, her hands blistered and calloused and blistered again. She lost weight, her dresses hung loose, her face went angular, but the woodpile grew. 1.5 cords. She needed 8. She was doing the numbers in her head again, always the numbers, when the thought came to her. Ingrid was kneeling by the creek, filling the water buckets on a late July morning when the heat was already thick and the children were still asleep. She was tired. She was always tired now, the kind of tired that settled into bones and didn't leave with sleep. Her hands, submerged in the cold creek water, ached from the axe work she'd done the day before. She thought about heat, about cold, about all the fires she had built in her life, and she thought about her father. Niels Larsen had been a stonemason in Trondheim, not famous, not wealthy, but skilled. He built the Kakaloven stoves that heated Norwegian homes, massive constructions of soapstone and brick that absorbed heat from a fire and released it slowly, hour after hour, long after the flames died. Ingrid remembered sitting beside the stove in their house as a child, pressing her back against stone that stayed warm all night. She remembered her father explaining how it worked. The stone remembers the fire, he had said. You burn hot in the morning, and the stone holds that heat. It gives it back slowly, like a gift it saved for you. In Minnesota, they had used an iron stove, good enough for the winters there, with forests nearby and wood cheap and plentiful. In Dakota, she had an iron stove too, the only kind she could afford, the only kind most settlers used. Iron heated fast and cooled fast. Build a fire, the stove threw heat. Let the fire die, the stove went cold, and the cold crept back. Stone heated slow and cooled slow. The Kakaloven in her childhood home had weighed over a ton. It took half a day to warm up properly, but once warm, it stayed warm through the longest winter night. Ingrid pulled her hands from the creek and sat back on her heels, water dripping from her fingers onto the dry grass. She couldn't build a kakalov. The proper ones had channels inside, paths for the smoke to travel through, extracting heat before it escaped up the chimney. Those required expertise she didn't have, fire bricks she couldn't get, and time she couldn't spare. But what if she could capture some of the principle? Her iron stove threw heat into the room. Most of that heat rose to the ceiling and leaked through gaps in the walls and disappeared. When the fire died, the heat went with it. But if something dense sat near the stove, something that could absorb that escaping heat, the energy wouldn't be lost. It would be stored. Stone held heat differently than air. A hot stone stayed hot long after a hot room went cold. What if stone sat near the stove and captured the heat that would otherwise escape? Not a stone stove, too complex. A stone mass. A column. A thermal battery. Ingrid stood up, water buckets forgotten. If it worked, she would need less wood. Maybe half as much. The impossible math might become possible. If it failed, she would have spent precious weeks building a useless rock pile while winter crept closer. There was no safe path. Every choice was a gamble. She chose the stone. Martha Hendricks came by in early August, walking the 1.5 miles from her own claim with a jar of preserved beans and a worried expression. Martha was 36, the mother of 3, a practical woman who had survived 2 Dakota winters and had the weathered hands to prove it. She was the closest thing Ingrid had to a friend, which meant she visited once a month and offered advice that was usually right. She found Ingrid dragging a stone across the prairie, using a makeshift sledge of boards and rope. The stone weighed about 60 pounds. Ingrid had already moved 4 that morning. "What in the name of all that's holy are you doing?" Martha asked. Ingrid straightened up, wiping sweat from her face with a forearm. "Gathering stone." "I can see that. What for?" "I am building something inside the cabin." Martha's expression shifted from confusion to concern. "Inside?" "A column, stone stacked and mortared, near the stove." "A stone column, inside your cabin?" Martha's voice was careful now, the way you spoke to someone who might not be thinking clearly. "Ingrid, honey, why?" Ingrid explained. The principle, the physics, the way her father's stove worked, the way stone held heat. She talked about iron cooling fast and stone cooling slow, about capturing heat that would otherwise escape, about the numbers that didn't add up any other way. Martha listened. When Ingrid finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "I've never heard of anyone doing that," Martha said finally. "Neither have I." "You're already behind on wood. You know that. My husband says you've got maybe 2 cords, and you need 8. "I can't get 8 cords, Martha. I've accepted that. So I need something else." "But what if it doesn't work? What if you spend all of August building a rock pile and it doesn't do anything? Then you've got even less wood and a useless pile of stones." Ingrid picked up the rope again. "Then I freeze. Same as if I keep hauling wood and come up short anyway. At least this way, I have a chance." Martha shook her head slowly. "I don't understand how rocks can make you warmer. Heat comes from fire. Rocks just sit there." "Rocks that have been heated by fire give that heat back. Slowly. Over hours." "And you learned this where? In Norway?" "My father built stoves that worked this way. I saw it with my own eyes, every winter of my childhood." Martha looked at the stones Ingrid had gathered, a pile of field stone near the cabin, maybe 800 pounds. Then she looked at Ingrid, sweat-soaked and thin, muscles visible in her forearms where the fat had burned away. "I hope you're right," Martha said, "because I don't want to find you frozen when spring comes." She left the preserved beans on the cabin step and walked home. The rumor spread. By mid-August, the people of De Smet and the surrounding claims knew about the Norwegian widow who was building a stone pile in her cabin. Most of them laughed, though not to her face. Some shook their heads in pity. A few wondered if she'd lost her mind from grief. Cyrus Tatum heard and saw opportunity. Tatum was 42, a land speculator from Sioux Falls who had bought 11 failed homestead claims in 2 years. He didn't farm. He didn't build. He watched settlers struggle and fail, then bought their claims for pennies and resold them to the next wave of hopeful fools. He had approached Ingrid twice already, once in June, once in July, offering $30 for her land. She had refused. Now, on a hot August afternoon, he found her in DeSmet at Garrett's store, buying clay for mortar. "Mrs. Svensson," he tipped his hat, "I hear you've taken up masonry." Ingrid didn't look at him. "Mr. Tatum? Building a monument inside your cabin, people say. A pillar of stone." His voice carried, and 2 other customers turned to listen. "I have to say, when a widow starts stacking rocks instead of gathering wood, it does make a man wonder about her state of mind." "My mind is my concern. Your mind, perhaps. But those children," Tatum shook his head with practiced sorrow. "The girl is what, 6? 7? And the boy, hardly more than a baby. They deserve better than a mother chasing fairy tales while winter comes." The other customers murmured. Ingrid felt their eyes. "Your concern is touching, Mr. Tatum." "It's genuine, I assure you, which is why my offer still stands. $35 for your claim. I've raised it, you see, out of Christian charity. $35, and you could take your children somewhere safe, somewhere with a future." Ingrid finally turned to face him. Tatum was not tall, but he stood close enough to loom. His eyes were mild, his smile gentle, his threat perfectly clear. "When I fail," Ingrid said, keeping her voice steady, "you'll buy my claim from the land office for back taxes and filing fees. That's $10, maybe 12. Then you'll sell it for 80 to someone who doesn't know better. That's your plan." Tatum's smile didn't waver. "I'm a businessman, Mrs. Svensson. I see opportunities where others see tragedy. It's a service I provide." "Then provide it somewhere else. My claim isn't for sale." She paid for her clay and walked out. Behind her, she heard Tatum say to the room, "Mark my words, she'll come to her senses when the snow flies. And if she doesn't, well, winter settles a lot of arguments." September. The column rose. Ingrid had gathered 2,200 pounds of field stone by the end of August, limestone mostly, with some granite, selected for density and durability. She'd tested each stone by setting it near the fire and watching for cracks. 3 shattered from hidden moisture and were discarded. The rest were sound. The foundation came first. She dug 8 inches into the cabin's dirt floor, laid flat stones across the bottom, and packed gravel around them. The weight needed distribution. 1,900 pounds concentrated on soft ground would sink and shift. She'd seen chimneys fall for this reason. Her column would not fall. The first course went down on September 2nd. Largest stones on the bottom, fitted together like puzzle pieces, mortared with a mixture of local clay and sand. The mortar smelled like river mud. It stuck to everything, her hands, her clothes, the children's feet when they tracked through the work site. Anna learned to mix it, standing on a stool to stir the bucket. Carl learned to stay out of the way, which was harder. Each course took a full day. Set the stones, apply the mortar, check for level, let it cure overnight. The column rose 1 foot, then 2, then 3, and the weather changed. The first frost came on September 23rd, 2 weeks early. Ingrid woke to ice on the water bucket and breath fogging in the cabin air. The fire had died overnight. She was rationing wood already, and the cold had crept in. But the column, 2 feet tall and growing, held a residual warmth from the previous day's fire. Faint, but noticeable. Ingrid put her palm against it and felt heat stored in the stone. It was working. The principle was sound. But October was coming, and October on the Dakota plains was when the real cold began. Josiah Garrett passed her cabin in late September, saw the column through the window, and shook his head without stopping. Later, at the store, he told anyone who would listen, "That woman built a rock pile where her stove should breathe. She'll smother her own fire and freeze faster for the effort." His words traveled. By the time Martha Hendricks reported them to Ingrid, they had become the community verdict. The Norwegian widow was either foolish or mad, and either way she wouldn't see spring. Ingrid kept building. The setback came on October 3rd. 3 days of rain, cold rain, not quite sleet, turned the prairie into mud and the creek into a torrent. Ingrid had cached 3/4 of a cord of wood on the far bank, stacked and covered with canvas, waiting to be hauled across during dry weather. The creek rose 4 feet overnight. The canvas blew away. The wood, when the water finally receded on October 6th, was soaked through and scattered downstream. Some logs had floated 100 yards. Others had sunk into the mud. Ingrid stood on the bank and looked at 3 weeks of work destroyed. She had counted on that wood. With it, she would have had 4.5 cords, barely enough with the column to survive. Without it, she had 3 3/4. The numbers turned against her again. She sat down in the mud and put her head in her hands. The column was finished, 4 feet 8 inches tall, 1,900 pounds, exactly as she had planned. It absorbed heat beautifully. She had tested it through 2 nights of frost and watched the cabin hold warmth for 8 hours after the fire died. The principle worked. But the principle needed fuel to start with. Stone could not create heat, only store it. And she was 7/8 of a cord short of what she needed, with winter coming in weeks. That was when Henrik Olsen found her. Olsen was 72 years old, a Norwegian immigrant who had come to Dakota Territory in 1876 and given up homesteading after his wife died. He lived in De Smet now, mending equipment and telling stories about the old country to anyone who would listen. He had heard about Ingrid, the Norwegian woman with the stone column, and had walked 3 miles to see for himself. He found her sitting in the mud by the flooded creek, staring at nothing. "Mrs. Svensson?" he said, and the Norwegian accent made her name sound like home. "I came to see your kakaloven." Ingrid looked up. An old man with a white beard and kind eyes stood on the bank, his coat patched and his boots worn through at the toes. "It's not a kakaloven," she said. "Not really, just a column. I don't have the skill for the real thing." "Show me." She led him back to the cabin. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, studying the column, then walked a slow circle around it. He touched the stone with both hands, pressed his cheek against it, closed his eyes. "You built this yourself," he said. "The foundation, the mortar, the courses." "Yes." "Your father was a stonemason." It wasn't a question, but Ingrid answered anyway. "In Trondheim, he built kakkelovner for half the houses in our district." "I knew a man who worked that way in Bergen." Olsen opened his eyes and smiled. "The stone remembers the fire." "That's what my father said." Olsen nodded slowly. Then he looked around the cabin, the thin bedding, the half-empty food stores, the woodpile that was visibly too small, and his smile faded. "You're short on fuel." "I lost a cache to the flood, 3/4 of a cord." "That's bad." "I know." Olsen was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My wife had a coat. Good wool, warm. She's been gone 6 years, and I have no daughter to give it to. It's doing nothing but taking space in my trunk." He met Ingrid's eyes. "I could trade it to you. For a day's help with mending, perhaps. My hands aren't what they used to be. The coat was worth $20. A day's mending was worth 3 at most. Both of them knew it was charity. Ingrid's throat tightened. She thought about pride. She thought about her children, shivering in thin clothes as the temperature dropped. I would be grateful for the trade, she said. Olson nodded, satisfied. I'll bring it tomorrow. And Mrs. Svensson, he pointed north. There's deadfall about 6 miles that direction, along a dry wash. Cottonwood, mostly. Closer than the Big Sioux. It's on my old claim, but I've no use for it now. Take what you need. He left before she could thank him properly. Ingrid stood in the cabin with her children and felt something she had not felt in months. Hope. Fragile, conditional, but real. She made 3 trips to Olson's deadfall in late October, hauling what her cow could pull. 1.5 cords added to her supply. 5 1/4 cords. Still short, but closer than she'd ever expected. The first blizzard struck on October 15th. Ingrid had read about Dakota winters. She had heard the stories. She thought she understood. She did not understand. The storm came from the northwest without warning. Clear sky at noon, wall of white by 3 o'clock. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in 6 hours. The wind rose until it screamed. Snow fell so thick that Ingrid, standing in her doorway, could not see the woodpile 12 feet away. She pulled the children inside and barred the door and built the fire hotter than she'd ever built it. The cabin shook with the wind. Snow forced its way through cracks she hadn't known existed, accumulating in thin lines along the walls. The stove roared. The column, positioned 3 feet away with a 4-inch air gap, began to absorb the heat. Ingrid watched it happen, watched the stone darken slightly as it warmed, watched the air around it shimmer. By evening, the column was hot to the touch all the way around. She banked the fire at bedtime, leaving just enough coals to restart in the morning. At 2 in the morning, she woke from habit and checked the cabin. The fire was out, nothing but ash in the stove. The storm still raged outside, wind howling like something alive. The cabin was cold, but not freezing. The column radiated heat into the darkness. Ingrid held her hand 6 inches from the stone and felt warmth push against her palm. She went back to bed. In the morning, with the storm still roaring, she relit the fire and took stock. The cabin had held at 44 degrees through the night, cold but survivable. Without the column, without that stored heat radiating through the dark hours, it would have dropped to freezing or below. The principle worked, under real conditions, under pressure. But the storm lasted 4 days, and when it finally broke, Ingrid walked outside into a white world and understood that what she had just survived was only the beginning. November brought more storms. December brought worse. The pattern emerged. 3 days of clear cold, then a blizzard that lasted anywhere from 2 days to a week. The temperature swung between 10 above zero and 30 below. The wind never really stopped. By Christmas, Ingrid had burned 2 1/4 cords. She had 3 cords left. The column performed beyond her expectations. With hot fires during the day and banked coals at night, the cabin maintained temperatures between 45 and 55 degrees. She learned the rhythm: burn hard in the morning, let the column absorb, burn medium through the afternoon, bank at sunset, let the column release heat through the night. The stone's memory stretched 10, sometimes 12 hours. Martha Hendricks visited in early January, trudging through snow that reached her thighs. She stood in Ingrid's cabin and marveled at the warmth. "We've burned 4 cords already," Martha said. "Half our supply. And our cabin never feels this warm." "The stone helps?" "I don't understand how." "It stores the heat. Like a battery stores electricity, that's what the magazines call it. The stone holds the fire's energy and gives it back slowly. Martha put her hand on the column. Her eyes widened. It's warm. The fire's barely burning, and it's warm. It will stay warm for hours after the fire dies. Hours? Martha shook her head. We've been feeding our stove all night. Whoever's on watch, just feeding it, and it's still cold by morning. Ingrid said nothing. She thought about the wood she had lost in the flood. She thought about how close she had come to being exactly where Martha was now. You should build one, Ingrid said. In the spring. I'll show you how. If we make it to spring, Martha's voice cracked slightly. Tom's worried. We've got 3 cords left, and there's 4 months until the ground thaws. He says we might have to burn the rocking chair. My mother's rocking chair. Ingrid thought about Tatum's words. Winter settles a lot of arguments. I'll share if it comes to that, she said. I can't spare much, but I won't let you freeze. Martha hugged her, the first real human contact Ingrid had felt in weeks, and walked home through the snow. That night, alone with her children and her column and the howling wind, Ingrid did the math again. 3 cords, 4 months. The column stretched each cord further than it should go. It might be enough. But the real test hadn't come yet. The old-timers said January was the worst, and January was just beginning. What came next would be worse than anything she had survived so far. January 6th, 1881. The sky turned the color of bruised metal, and the wind shifted northwest. Ingrid had learned to read the signs. The way the air felt before a storm, heavier, charged with something electric. The way the animals behaved, her cow refusing to leave the shed, the chickens huddled silent in their coop. The way the old-timers in De Smet went quiet and checked their supplies and nailed boards over windows. This storm would be different. She could feel it in her bones. She spent the morning hauling wood from the shed to the cabin, stacking it against the interior wall until there was barely room to move. 2 weeks' worth at normal burn rate, maybe 3 weeks if she was careful. The column had changed everything. She no longer needed to feed the fire through the night, no longer watched heat disappear the moment the flames died, but she still needed fuel to start with. Stone could store heat. Stone could not create it. By noon, the first flakes fell. By 2 o'clock, the world had vanished. The storm hit like a wall, not a gradual building, but a sudden erasure of everything beyond the cabin walls. One moment, Ingrid could see the shed 30 feet away. The next moment, she could see nothing but white, swirling and screaming, snow so fine it seemed more like smoke than ice. The temperature, which had hovered near 0 at midday, began to fall. 20 below by sunset, 30 below by midnight, 40 below by dawn, and it did not stop. Day 2. The storm raged without pause. Ingrid built the fire hot and kept it hot, watching the column absorb heat, watching the stone darken as it warmed. The cabin held at 50 degrees while the world outside tried to kill everything in it. Carl woke with a fever. He was 4 years old, small for his age, with his father's blonde hair and his mother's stubborn jaw. He had been healthy through the fall, healthy through the early winter storms, laughing and playing even when confined to the cabin for days at a time. But on the morning of day 2, his forehead burned under Ingrid's palm, and his breath came in shallow rasps. "Mama," he said. "Cold." He was lying 3 feet from the stove, wrapped in every blanket Ingrid owned. The cabin was 50 degrees. He was shivering. Ingrid knew what this was. She had seen it before, in Minnesota, in Norway. Respiratory infection. Lung fever, some called it. Pneumonia, if it got bad enough. Children died from this. Strong children, healthy children, children with two parents, and a warm house and a doctor nearby. Carl had one parent, a cabin heated by stone and desperate innovation, and the nearest doctor was in Brookings, 40 miles away through a blizzard that had already killed visibility and would kill anything that tried to move through it. She made him drink water. She kept him close to the column where the radiant heat was strongest. She watched his breathing and counted the seconds between each shallow inhale. Anna, 7 years old, sat in the corner with her knees pulled to her chest. She didn't ask if her brother would be all right. She was old enough to know that some questions had no good answers. Day 3. Carl's fever climbed. His cough turned wet, rattling in his chest like stones in a jar. He stopped asking for water. Ingrid had to lift his head and press the cup to his lips, watching to make sure he swallowed. The storm showed no sign of breaking. The snow had drifted against the cabin's north wall until it reached the window. She could see nothing through the glass but packed white. The wind found every crack, every gap, every imperfection in the construction, and drove fine snow through until thin lines of white accumulated along the walls. The wood supply inside the cabin was holding, but it wouldn't last forever. 2 weeks' worth at normal burn, she had estimated, but she wasn't burning normal. She was burning hot, trying to keep Carl warm, trying to fight the fever with the only weapon she had. At the current rate, the wood would last 8 days, maybe 9. The storm had already lasted 3. Ingrid did not let herself calculate what would happen if it lasted 10. Day 4. The wind dropped for 6 hours in the early morning, and Ingrid thought the storm might be breaking. She opened the door to check the woodshed, to gauge how much fuel remained there, to plan for the days ahead. She could not see the shed. The brief calm had not cleared the air. The snow still fell thick enough to erase everything beyond 10 feet. The shed was 30 feet away. It might as well have been 30 miles. By noon, the wind returned, worse than before. Carl's fever broke that afternoon. His temperature dropped, his breathing eased, his eyes focused for the first time in 2 days. He asked for food, a good sign, and Ingrid fed him broth made from the last of their dried beef. But Anna started coughing. Not the deep rattling cough of her brother, a dry cough, a tickle in the throat, the beginning of something that might become serious or might fade on its own. Ingrid watched her daughter and felt the fear she had been holding back finally crack through her defenses. Both children, both sick or getting sick, and the storm still raged, day 4 now, with no sign of ending. She counted the wood stacked against the wall. 6 days' worth at current burn, maybe 7 if she cut back. But cutting back meant letting the cabin cool. Letting the cabin cool meant the children's illnesses could worsen, could become the thing that killed them. The column radiated heat. The stone remembered every fire she had built, held that memory in its mass, gave it back slowly through the dark hours. But even the column could not help if there was no fire to remember. She needed more wood. Day 5. Dawn came gray and howling. The storm had not broken. The temperature outside had fallen to 45 below zero. Ingrid knew because she had checked the small thermometer nailed to the exterior wall, reaching her arm through a crack in the door to read it. 45 below, with wind that made it feel like 70 below. Cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes. Cold enough to kill. Inside, the wood supply was down to 5 days. The children were both sick now. Carl recovering but still weak, Anna developing the same fever that had nearly taken her brother. They lay together on the bed, wrapped in quilts, pressed against each other for warmth. The woodshed was 30 feet away. Inside it, enough wood to last another 3 weeks. 30 feet. Ingrid stood at the cabin door and stared into the white void. She could see nothing. The world beyond the threshold had ceased to exist. There was only wind and snow and cold so intense it hurt to breathe. She thought about the people who had died walking 10 feet in storms like this. Cecilia Knutson, who had frozen 40 steps from her front door while searching for her husband. Old Thailand, who had died 12 feet from home after tending his livestock. The snow disoriented, the wind pushed. The cold stole strength faster than anyone expected. 30 feet there, 30 feet back, 1 minute of walking in good conditions. An eternity in this. Ingrid found the rope coiled in the corner, 40 feet of hemp she had bought for the cow. She tied one end to the iron loop beside the door, the loop Eric had installed for hanging tools. She tied the other end around her waist, pulling the knot tight until it hurt. "Anna," she said. Her daughter looked up from the bed, eyes bright with fever. "I'm going to the woodshed. I'll be right back. If I'm not back in 10 minutes, you stay here. You keep the fire going. You don't open that door for anything. Do you understand?" Anna nodded. She was 7. She understood that her mother might not come back. Ingrid pulled on Henrik Olsen's wife's coat, the charity coat, the gift that had cost her pride, and wrapped a scarf around her face until only her eyes showed. She opened the door. The cold hit like a fist. It drove the breath from her lungs, stung her eyes, found every gap in her clothing, and reached through with frozen fingers. The wind shoved her sideways, and she grabbed the door frame to keep from falling. She could see nothing. The shed was invisible. The world was white in every direction, not the white of snow, but the white of void, of emptiness, of a place where direction and distance had ceased to mean anything. She stepped out. 1 step. 2. The rope paid out behind her, her lifeline back to the cabin, to the children, to everything that mattered. She kept one hand on the rope and extended the other in front of her, feeling for obstacles, for the shed wall, for anything solid in the swirling chaos. 3 steps. 4. The wind pushed her left and she corrected, but which way was the shed? She had walked this path 100 times, 30 feet straight from the door, but straight meant nothing in the white void. Every direction looked the same. 5 steps. 6. Her hand touched nothing. The rope continued to pay out. How far had she come? 10 feet? 20? She couldn't tell. The world had no reference points. She was walking through cotton, through smoke, through a dream that had no end. 7 steps. 8. The rope grew taut. She was nearing its limit. 40 feet of rope, and the shed was 30 feet away. She should have reached it by now had she veered off course. Was she walking parallel to the shed, about to pass it entirely? If the rope ran out before she found it, she would have to turn back. Try again. Fail again. 9 steps. Her hand struck wood, the shed wall, rough planks under her frozen fingers. She felt along the surface, found the door, pulled it open against the wind. Inside, darkness and stillness, and the blessed absence of wind. Stacked wood, covered in frost but dry. Fuel. Life. She grabbed what she could carry, 3 logs under each arm, balanced against her chest. 20 pounds, maybe 25. Not enough to matter, but all she could manage with numb hands and the wind waiting outside. She stepped back into the storm. The return was worse. The rope was her only guide, and her hands were too cold to grip it properly. She followed it hand over hand, pulling herself along, fighting the wind that tried to push her off course. The log slipped. She dropped one and couldn't stop to find it. Stopping meant freezing, meant death, meant her children alone in the cabin waiting for a mother who would never return. The cabin door appeared as a dark shape in the white void. She fell through it, logs scattering across the floor, and Anna was there, pushing the door closed against the wind, her small body braced against the wood. Ingrid lay on the floor and listened to her own breathing. Her hands burned as feeling returned. Her face felt like ice cracking. She had made the trip. 30 feet there, 30 feet back. She had retrieved enough wood for another day. The storm lasted 4 more days. On the 9th day, the wind stopped. Ingrid woke to silence. True silence. The absence of the howling that had been constant for over a week. She opened her eyes and saw light through the frost-covered window. Real light. Sunlight. She opened the door to a transformed world. Snow had drifted to 8 feet against the north wall, burying the window entirely. The shed was a white mound with only its roof peak visible. The landscape stretched flat and glittering to every horizon, unmarked by any sign of human presence. The temperature was still 30 below, but the wind was gone and the sky was clear, and after 9 days of siege, the storm had finally broken. Carl was sitting up. His fever had passed 3 days earlier, and he was eating solid food again, though he had lost weight that would take months to recover. Anna's illness had peaked on day 6 and faded by day 8, shorter and milder than her brother's, though bad enough that Ingrid had barely slept for 2 days. Both children were alive. Both were recovering. Ingrid walked to the column and placed her hand against the stone. Still warm. The fire had burned low overnight, down to coals, but the column held heat from the fires of the past week, stored energy radiating back into the cabin, keeping the temperature at 47 degrees even with the stove barely lit. She had entered the storm with 5 1/4 cords of wood. She had 1 1/2 cords left. The column had saved them. Without it, she would have burned through her entire supply in 6 days, maybe 7. The stone had stretched each log, captured heat that would have escaped, given it back through the endless dark hours. The stone had remembered every fire and held that memory against the cold. But what about the neighbors? Martha Hendricks appeared on snowshoes the next morning, her face wind-burned and her eyes hollow. She had walked 1.5 miles through snow that reached her thighs, breaking trail the entire way, because she needed to know if Ingrid was alive. "You're here," Martha said. She stood in the doorway and stared at the cabin's interior, the sleeping children, the banked fire, the stone column radiating warmth. "You're alive." "We're alive." "We didn't know. Tom wanted to check on you 3 days ago, but the storm," Martha's voice caught. "We burned 5 cords. 5 cords in 9 days. We started with 6. We've got 1 cord left, and there's still 3 months of winter." Ingrid felt the number like a physical weight. 1 cord for 3 months. That was death. That was the math that killed people. "We burned the rocking chair," Martha continued. "My mother's chair, the one I carried from Pennsylvania. We burned it on day 7 because we ran out of wood for 4 hours and the temperature dropped to 38 degrees inside. My children were crying from the cold." "Martha, how much do you have left?" Ingrid hesitated. The truth felt like cruelty. 1.5 cords. Martha closed her eyes. "You started with less than we did. You have more left." "The column." I know. Martha opened her eyes and looked at the stone pillar in the center of the room. 1,900 pounds of field stone that had seemed like madness 7 months ago. "The rock pile, your father's invention. My father's principle. I just built a simpler version." Martha walked to the column and pressed both hands against it. The stone was warm to the touch, not hot, not like fresh bread, but warm like sun-heated earth, warm enough to feel through her frozen gloves. "It's still giving heat," she said. "The fire's almost out, and it's still giving heat. For hours, sometimes 10, sometimes 12. Depends on how hot I build the fire during the day. We could have built one last summer when you were stacking rocks, I thought." Martha stopped, shook her head. I thought you were wasting time. I told Tom you'd lost your mind from grief. You weren't the only one. I was wrong. I was wrong, and now I have 1 cord of wood and 3 children and 3 months until the ground thaws. Martha's voice broke. I don't know what we're going to do. Ingrid thought about Garrett's words. Winter settles a lot of arguments. She thought about Tatum's smirk, his certainty that she would fail. She thought about all the people who had dismissed her, pitied her, laughed at the Norwegian widow with the rock pile. I can spare 1/2 cord, she said. It's not much, but it will help. Martha stared at her. You can't. You need it. The stone stretches what I have. 1/2 cord for me is like a full cord for you. Ingrid put her hand on Martha's shoulder. Take it, keep your children warm, and in the spring we'll build you a column of your own. Martha hugged her, the second time in 6 months, and cried against her shoulder. Josiah Garrett came 2 days later. He had not visited Ingrid's cabin since the previous June, when he told her to sell her claim and go back east. He had watched her stack rocks through the summer and shaken his head. He had spread the word that she would freeze faster for her foolishness. He had waited for Winter to prove him right. Winter had proved him wrong. He stood in her doorway, hat in his hands, and looked at the cabin. The fire burning low in the stove. The children playing on the floor, thinner than they should be, but alive. And the column, the stone pillar that rose from the floor like a monument, radiating heat hours after the flames had died. May I come in? He asked. Ingrid stepped aside. Garrett walked a slow circle around the column, just as Henrik Olsen had done months before. He touched the stone, felt its warmth, studied the mortar lines and the fitted courses. I burned 7 cords, he said finally. His voice was quiet, humbled. 7 cords in that storm, and I started with 8. I'm down to 1 cord, same as Martha Hendricks, same as half the county. He turned to face her. How many did you burn? 3 3/4 total through the whole winter so far. And you started with? 5 1/4. Garrett did the math. His face changed. You burned less than half what I did. The stone holds the heat. You build the fire once, and it keeps giving back for hours. I told you a woman alone couldn't make it. Garrett's jaw worked. The words came hard for him. Ingrid could see that. He was a proud man, an experienced man, a man who had survived 2 Dakota winters through knowledge and preparation. Admitting he was wrong cost him something real. I was wrong. You weren't wrong about the math, Ingrid said. I couldn't have cut 8 cords. You were right about that. I found a different answer. A better answer. A different one. It might not work for everyone. Not everyone has stone nearby, or the skill to stack it, or... It's better, Garrett said firmly. What you did this column, it's better than what I did, better than what any of us did. He met her eyes. I'd like to learn how to build one. For my cabin, for next winter. 6 months ago, this man had told her that pride would kill her children. Now he stood in her cabin asking to learn from her. I'll teach anyone who wants to know, Ingrid said. No charge, just bring your own stones. The winter ground on through February and into March. 2 more blizzards struck, neither as severe as the 9-day siege in January, but harsh enough to test everyone. Ingrid gave 1/2 cord to Martha Hendricks and 1/4 cords to 2 other families whose supplies ran critical. She could afford the charity. The column made her wood go twice as far as her neighbors, and that margin meant the difference between survival and death. Cyrus Tatum did not appear again. She learned later that he had left for Sioux Falls in late January, muttering about a county with no sense. His dream of buying her claim for pennies had died in the same storm that nearly killed her children. She felt no triumph in his departure, only relief. In April, the snow finally began to melt. Muddy water pooled everywhere, and the creek rose again, but this time Ingrid watched from her cabin instead of watching it destroy her woodpile. The earth thawed. The grass started to green. Birds returned, meadowlarks and sparrows and geese honking north in long formations. The hard winter of 1880 to 1881 was over. Later counts would show that it was the worst winter in Dakota Territory's recorded history. Continuous blizzards from October to April, snow accumulation exceeding 11 feet in some areas, temperatures falling to 40 below zero repeatedly. The railroad had stopped running from January to May, cutting off supplies to every settlement along the line. Dozens of settlers had died, some frozen in their cabins, others lost in the white void between home and barn. Ingrid Svensson and her 2 children survived. They survived because of a stone column that weighed 1,900 pounds and stood 4 feet 8 inches tall. A column that absorbed heat during the day and released it through the night. A column that turned 5 cords of wood into the equivalent of 10. A column that every expert in the county had dismissed as foolishness. The stone had remembered the fire, and that memory had kept 3 people alive through the worst winter anyone had ever seen. In the spring of 1881, 3 families built thermal mass columns in their cabins, learning the technique from Ingrid. By the following spring, the number was 11. By 1885, when Ingrid officially proved up her homestead claim and took legal title to her land, the thermal mass column had become common in parts of Kingsbury County. Not everyone adopted it. Tradition dies hard, and many settlers continued to trust what they had always known. More wood, bigger fires, endurance through force rather than efficiency. But those who built the columns reported consistent results. Fuel consumption cut by 40 to 60%, cabin temperatures more stable through the night, children sleeping through until morning instead of waking to feed the fire. The innovation spread beyond Dakota. Norwegian and Swedish immigrants carried the principle to Minnesota, to Wisconsin, to anywhere cold winters demanded efficient heating. It merged with other traditions: Finnish sauna heating, German Kachelofens, Russian pechka stoves, and evolved into more sophisticated forms: brick heat sinks, tile stoves, integrated masonry heaters with internal channels. Ingrid's simple column was never the most efficient design. A proper masonry heater, with its labyrinth of flue passages, could capture 90% of a fire's energy. Her column captured maybe 30 or 40%, but it was buildable by anyone with access to stone and clay, requiring no special expertise, no expensive materials, no skills beyond patience and persistence. That accessibility was its genius, not the physics. The physics had been known for centuries. The genius was making the principle available to a widow with 2 children and no one to help her. Ingrid Svensson never remarried. She raised Anna and Carl alone on the homestead Eric had claimed, expanding the cabin over the years, adding rooms and outbuildings as the farm grew. The original column remained in place. She replastered it annually, patching cracks, maintaining the structure that had saved her family, and visitors from across the county came to see it. Anna grew up to become a teacher, working in Dakota schools for 3 decades. She taught reading and arithmetic and history, but she also taught the story of her mother's column to any student who would listen. "My mother kept us alive with physics and stubbornness," she would say. "Remember that when someone tells you something is impossible." Carl took over the homestead when Ingrid grew too old to work it. He farmed the land until the drought of 1934 drove him off. But before he left, he dismantled the original cabin carefully, stone by stone. The column had to be broken apart. It was too heavy to move intact, but Carl saved several stones and carried them to Minnesota, where his children grew up. Ingrid died in 1912 at the age of 61. He was buried on the homestead beside the cabin she had built, with a headstone that read only, "She kept the warmth." By then, the world had changed. Coal had become cheap and plentiful. Railroads ran reliably through the winter. Central heating was replacing wood stoves in towns and cities. The urgency that had driven settlers to burn furniture to survive was fading into memory, becoming the stuff of stories told by grandparents to children who could barely imagine such desperation. The thermal mass column faded with it. Not because it didn't work, it worked beautifully, but because it was no longer necessary. The problem it solved had been solved by other means. The knowledge didn't die exactly. It just became invisible, absorbed into the background of how things were done, taken for granted by builders who no longer remembered why it mattered. But knowledge has a way of returning when conditions demand it. In the 1970s, an energy crisis sent Americans searching for alternatives to expensive heating oil. Architects and builders rediscovered what European peasants had known for centuries and what Ingrid Svensson had proven on the Dakota plains. Dense materials store heat, and stored heat radiates slowly. The Masonry Heater Association of North America was founded in the 1980s, documenting techniques that trace back through Finnish contraflow heaters and Russian pechkas to medieval tile stoves and Roman hypocausts. Modern masonry heaters achieve efficiency ratings of 75 to 90%, 5 to 9 times better than an open fireplace, twice as good as a standard wood stove. The principle is now taught in architecture schools. Passive solar designs incorporate thermal mass walls that absorb sunlight during the day and release heat at night. Energy-efficient homes use concrete floors and stone facades as thermal batteries, moderating temperature swings, reducing fuel consumption, keeping occupants comfortable with less energy. Engineers call it thermal mass. They measure it in British thermal units per pound per degree Fahrenheit and calculate optimal placement relative to heat sources. They publish papers and build computer models and optimize designs to fractions of a percent. Ingrid Svensson called it the stone remembering the fire. In a garden in Minnesota, there is a stone. It is field stone, gray with flecks of white, worn smooth by hands that once pressed against it checking for warmth. It weighs perhaps 60 pounds. It sits among flowers now, decorative, unremarkable, one rock among many in a suburban landscape. But the family that owns it knows where it came from. They know it was once part of a column that stood in a cabin in Dakota Territory, built by a widow who refused to fail. They know it absorbed heat from fires that kept children alive through the worst winter in recorded history. They know the story. The stone has no memory now. It sits in the sun and the rain and does nothing but exist. The fire it once held is 140 years gone, but the principle remains. The physics hasn't changed. Dense materials absorb heat slowly, store it in their structure, release it gradually over time. A fire burns hot for hours. A stone can remember that heat for a day. This is what Ingrid understood, standing by a creek in Dakota in 1880, exhausted and terrified and facing a winter that everyone said would kill her. The solution wasn't more fuel. She couldn't get more fuel. The solution was keeping what she had. She built a stone column in the middle of her cabin. She stacked 1,900 pounds of fieldstone and mortared it with clay and sand. She positioned it 3 feet from her iron stove, close enough to capture radiant heat, far enough to let the door swing open. Her neighbors said she was wasting time. The experts said she would freeze faster for her foolishness. The speculators waited for her to fail. The stone remembered the fire. The fire kept her children alive. The children grew up and had children of their own, and those children had children. And somewhere in that long line, someone placed a worn gray stone in a garden in Minnesota and told their daughter where it came from. The frontier tested everyone who came to it. It took some and broke others and let a few through. The ones who survived weren't always the strongest or the richest or the best prepared. Sometimes they were the ones who asked a different question. Everyone asked, "How do I get more wood?" Ingrid asked, "How do I keep the heat I have?" That question and a 1,900-pound answer made all the difference. On a night in February 1881, with the temperature at 40 below and the wind screaming across the Dakota plains, a widow placed her hand against a stone column and felt warmth radiating back. Her children slept. The fire had died hours before. But the cabin held at 48 degrees, warm enough to survive, warm enough to dream. Outside, her neighbors burned furniture and prayed for morning. Inside, the stone remembered the fire and kept the warmth